so much for the kind introduction. And it is my privilege to be able to share my views, my process of thinking and reflecting in the Selma Medical Humanities Seminar Series. And it will be really nice to be presenting this presentation in front of you physically. So I hope that there will be an opportunity where we can do this. But for the time now that I will present in front of the screen, and if there's anything that comes to your mind that you have been wondering, or it's not clear, or you have something that you think that it resonates with your own research, please don't hesitate to let me know. It would be really great to discuss. So today I'm going to talk about decolonizing care, especially through telling stories as a researchers and from your own perspective while listening to the voices of Bnkis, which in Dayan means the elders. I'm Wasiq Silan. In Chinese, it's Gao Yan. I'm doing my postdoctoral research as introduced kindly by Martha and Avil in the beginning. I'm currently based in the University of Helsinki. And today I'm going to speak with you from the discipline a little bit on the intersection of sociology, social care, but mostly political science. I talk about power. I talk about how does care situate in this different context, and speaking from the experiences from my people, Dayan people in Taiwan, which is in East Asia. So please bear with me. It's a little bit different, but I hope that it will be interesting. So next page. Yes. So first I would like to acknowledge land. Soni kaniga New Sakumaki kalang Finland hejina Helsinki. Dayan samizo kaniga ini nebak balai. Vaki vava rkeyaknya. Kewan ini sevyaksunan mekeban isu. Skuramaku kalang samizok. Tematuk tunuksku bevenakis naha. Arin sarannya tehuk misu iaga anasu babaunya. So today I will cover first positioning of myself, Wasiq Silan, and how does this name come about? And then the context about indigenous peoples in Taiwan. And thirdly, why do I talk about decolonize, and why does decolonization needed in care? And fourthly, about Bnkis elders' stories. And lastly, some thoughts concerning discussion and conclusion. So I have just defended my thesis in mid-2000 this year. And if you are interested in downloading and reading about it, it's available from the Helsinki's online database as I edit here. So you're very welcome to come and read it and let me know what you think about it. And this work is mostly based on the work that I did there. So this is my grandmother on the left and me on the right. And my story is very much informed my process of doing a research. And I have many names throughout my life. When I was born, I was given a name in Mandarin Chinese, Chen Yan. And Chen is from the kingship from my grandfather's side, and Yan means easygoing and safe. And in the basic education years, I was given the name Grace, an internationalized name of relevance to religion and Americanization. And in the university years, I changed my last name from Chen to Gao, which by doing so, I get the indigenous status on my ID card. Although all of my life, I'm related to indigenous, but it is on that moment from the ID card that there is written, okay, so now you're indigenous Dayan person. So I'm using Gao Yan and Grace in the university years. And after starting my PhD, and moving to Finland doing the postdoctoral work, I am thinking that why not use Wasiq, the name that is given by my grandmother, which is on the left here. And it has her blessings and the elders' wishes. And I have never really think about that. So I'm thinking that I will use Wasiq more, as much as I can. I don't know what's going to happen next, but I'm just very happy to share this process of naming, and which also signifies my identity change throughout the years. And I have this constant fear that I don't feel that I'm indigenous enough. People would say that you don't look like us. But then I gradually realized that it is not about what other people think, but indigeneity, or what I define as indigenous, is more, it's not about how much indigenous blood I have. It's not about whether I speak perfect indigenous language. It is not about the appearance, that whether I look like the rest of the indigenous people, but it's more about my realization of living at the moment and commit to indigenous identity. So who are we talking about? So we're talking about the indigenous peoples in Taiwan, and I'll talk about the colonization, a little bit of history, so you can contextualize where I will be speaking about. So indigenous peoples in Taiwan are part of the Austronesians. So as you can see in this map, it is stretching from Madagascar on the left and all the way to Hawaii to the right, and then to the south it's for New Zealand. So this part of region is where we're talking about, and it is where the Austronesian peoples are. And Taiwan is situated in East Asia. Also, it is also part of the Asia, so it has an ocean side and also this Asian side. And it's the island that is very small. It's much smaller than Finland, and it's similar to the size of the Netherlands. The population is around 23 million, and there are many ethnicities, as 500,000 of indigenous peoples who are Austronesian people. And also we have people who migrated here later these years, and also the Taiwanese, which is the dominant ethnicity, and mostly coming settlers from China. And there are many Austronesian languages in Taiwan, as you can see on the map in the left. But also that there's just so many languages now in Taiwan, there's only 16 groups that were officially recognized by the state. And among these 16 groups, today I will talk about this, which is the Dayan group where I'm coming from. And all of us have different differences in culture, in language, in customs, in social structure. And mostly our language and our worldview is passed through oral history. So we don't have a written account of our history. And we have this Romanization system, which is learned from the Western missionaries. And Dayan, we are about 93,000 persons, and we are the third largest group in Taiwan. So why does decolonize matter in care? So this is, I will talk about. And to open up this idea, then this discussion, we need to look at Taiwan's colonial history. So the history of colonial rule in Taiwan it can be summarized by this. So there are waves of colonizers coming, the Han people, the Dutch people, Spanish, and Japanese from the 1895, and the Han Chinese people after that until now. And also there's a very important of democratization from 1987 until now, which opens up the possibility of recognize yourself as indigenous person. And so just to zoom in to the colonization in Taiwan, I want to bring your attention to the Japanese time, where we can see very clearly how colonization happened in its raw form. So on the right-hand side, you can see this picture that was taken in the village where I come from. And it is a picture where the Japanese police came into the village and then kind of gather everybody and then move everybody into this area where they can control. And what I wanted to talk here is that coloniality is not only about physically trying to control you, but also it's about controlling knowledge and subjectivity. But you can see from that it is like a layer upon layers of different ways of colonization, which has relevance to elderly care as we advance further later. So the Japanese came into our village, and you can hear them saying that first, we want the indigenous people to lay down their weapons. So it's basically a political colonization that happened. And then the Japanese people said, then we will take their land and their resources using their own labor. And this is the beginning of the economic colonization. And then the Japanese people said, last, we want to teach them to be Japanese. So we want them to forget about who they are. And this is a cultural and spiritual colonization. And lastly, which is most relevant to our talk today, is that this statement of we will give them subsidies in ways to reinforce their dependency on outsiders and instill the feeling of learned helplessness. And this idea of welfare colonization is what keeps me thinking throughout the years of doing elderly care in Taiwan. And I hope that you can think with me along these lines of different layers of colonization, and in particular, welfare colonization in its modern form. So to give an example in the visualized form, this is a picture that I took from a local church in the Dayan territory. So if you take a closer look, you will find out that, okay, so this is a localized Christianity where Jesus dressed up in the Dayan traditional bala. So this a traditional custom, and then doing this segment of Bible segment. So this is a visualization, as I see it, a spiritual and cultural form of converting indigenous Dayan into this new nation. So hopefully this will give you a clear idea of what it is. So now we talk about Dayan. Let's explain a little bit more. So as we say in the beginning, Dayan is part of the Austronesian language family. And according to the elders, the word Dayan is composed of mita, which is look after, and rakhya, which is land. So the Dayan itself ontologically means looking after and care for the land. And for us, the moral order Gaga and the omnipresent spirit Utuh constitute the core of Dayan law. So if the idea is that if you follow Gaga, you can maintain a balanced relationship with Utuh, and then there will be a kind of life energy existing in the land, the rivers and the mountains, trees and animals. So we have this kind of societal order based in Gaga and Utuh, but this order was disrupted by the colonizers. And during the colonization, the teachings of Bnkis elders have been marginalized, and people were told that Dayan language and culture had no practical use. And these social sufferings deepened the trauma across generations and created not only estranged youth, but it also uprooted the Dayan Bnkis. And I think this has a very important message when we're thinking about these devising elderly services or elderly care for the Dayan elders. So hopefully this is something that we will remember towards the end. And this colonization process can be also examined through the visualization of the loss of land. So the green part over here on the right is indigenous land, and the yellow is the civilized or national land. And throughout the years, from the beginning of 17th century all the way until now, it is a story of continuously losing our traditional territory, losing our land, losing our control over land. And this losing of control over land has very concrete consequences. For example, you can see it from the health inequity, that there is a glaring gap between the general Taiwanese population and the indigenous people as a whole. And it is also slowly closing up, but it is not nearly enough, and it does not live up to the standard of Taiwan said that, oh, we want to be a multicultural nation. But if you look at the statistic, it just doesn't add up. And if we look at the health resources, for example, on the right, it is the home care, doctoral visit resources that is available in Taiwan. So these are the red dots. But then if you look at the indigenous counties on the right, on the left, then you find out that within the indigenous counties, there's no such services. So it will have very concrete influence, impact on the indigenous health and long-term care. And it was not until 2016 that Taiwan officially apologized for their wrongdoings. And people said that it marked a milestone of recognition politics and opens up a more space for indigenous peoples to gain a larger extent of political, social, and cultural rights. On the left, it is the president of Taiwan, Tsai Ing-wen, and on the right, it is the indigenous representative from the Tao indigenous peoples. But it only marks the beginning because there's just so much to be done. There's so much injustice, and the idea of coloniality still continues throughout all the possible ways, including elderly care. So speaking of care, I would like to share with you briefly why does care matter in this context. And I will reflect this idea of care from my fieldwork experience in the Day Activity Center, which I call Day Club for the indigenous elders in Wulai, Taiwan. And the background image is the entry to the Day Club. So as you can see, it is like a village in the rural area. And the care for the elders are very important because that's how they can live as long as possible in the familiar space. So about aging and care. So studies have recorded that the concept of aging and care is very multi-layered. But even though that we know that, the biomedical perspective is very pervasive. So what is this biomedical perspective? As far as I understand it and put it to a very rough form, is that aging is an individual's irreversible decline and care is a buffer to delay the decline. So to visualize this biomedical perspective, let's look at Ministry of Health and Welfare from Taiwan. So they made this beautiful visualization of care items and services in long-term care 2.0. And it is from the left-hand side, healthy old person. And all the way, it is an irreversible decline from a healthy person to death, all the way declining further and further. And this is the telling of the story from the ruling, right? This is the colonizer's side of the story of biomedical decline. So we have to help you to delay this decline. But is this the only perspective that we can think about care? Indeed, it is not. So there are many alternative perspectives to that. And I argue that we need to create more space for an understanding outside the biomedical lens in both policies and practice. And we can achieve it by including voices from marginalized groups around care and aging, including indigenous peoples. And in fact, it was not until the last decade that mainstream medicine and the public health slowly started to acknowledge that if we want to live well, we need to look at broader dynamics, including the indigenous, culturally grounded understanding of aging and care. So let's look at the examples. The first example is aged care reconceptualized from the Sami perspective. So in Finland, according to the literature that I read, that older Sami conceptualize care as a being in control, that you know that you can control your life and living. And it's called Hyvinpärjääminen or Puresbirgen in North Sami. So for Sami, for the older Sami, it is aging and care is not just material or physical, but it is also psychological, social, emotional, mental, and ethical. And let's take another example from Dayan. So in Taiwan, the older Dayan understands care as keeping a balance under Gaga and Utuh, as we said earlier. And care is embedded in the balanced relationship between human and non-human, between Gaga and Utuh. And then we look at the third example of visualized medicine wheel from North America, that we can see that aging is indeed biological and psychological, but at the same time, it is also brings balance and it exists in all stages of life. And it is also part of the circle of relationship, this aging and care. So we talk about like indigenous ideas, but what is indigenous in particular? So here I will talk briefly about indigeneity, a theoretical framework. So the idea of indigeneity or indigenousness is to separate indigenous peoples and the others, so the non-indigenous. And while indigeneity is useful for the solidarity among indigenous peoples, it could also give a wrong impression and be quite problematic if you think that, okay, so indigenous people, they're all the same. They're all homogeneous and coherent. It is not. It is actually like many different competing voices, and it's a political process when we're hearing the voices of indigenous peoples. And also from the critical perspective, if you're familiar with the literature from, for example, the critical scholar Audra Simpson, she said that it is a highly political process when we're thinking about indigenous peoples, because settler states has made indigeneity into a condition marked with despair, and recognition and reconciliation is more like a fallacy that you will never achieve. And then it kind of also direct your attention away from true sovereignty that the indigenous people have in the first place. So I think these messages are very important when we're talking about indigenous peoples in here today. And to zoom in into Taiwan, it is precisely a very contested political category. So in Taiwan, being an indigenous is institutionalized in the Status Act. And according to the act, some people are worthy indigenous, some other people are not indigenous. And among those people who are recognized, there is also a different separation between those people who are more civilized and less civilized. And those people who are civilized deserve less care or less resources of care. And so as you can see that from the indigeneity process in Taiwan, that in being an indigenous becomes the geographical locations, and then whether you are towards the civilization of Han Chinese people, but it's not so much about your indigenous sovereignty or indigenous way of being and way of knowing. It has nothing to do with that. So it kind of makes you smell that there's something wrong, and then there's some coloniality that's still happening. And let's talk about the positioning of myself as a researcher in this process. So I think that I don't have time to talk about all of this. If you're interested, you can ask in the Q&A. But what I wanted to underline here is that I feel that myself as recognizing as a Taiwan researcher has informed my own making research process of trying to really ground my research through the indigenous research methodology, because I feel that it is so important. I don't want to repeat what other grand theories has tell me about it and then just make indigenous people the case. I feel the indigenous people's own ideas and epistemologies and methodologies are important in its own right. So I wanted to really act on that. That is where I'm coming from. And you can see it from the visualization that I've made throughout the dissertation process. It is like a storyboard that I visualize indigenous knowledge and epistemology methodology on the left, like in the booming tree, but it was like kind of influenced negatively by the red part coloniality. And our responsibility as a researcher is more in this green part, that we can really act on self-determination and try to bring back the power and the nutrients to this tree so the trees can grow again. So to make it in the very specific form, I would talk about the methodology, method, and data, and how I analyze the data, and then Bnkis voices. So I want to, through my research, employ an indigenous research paradigm in the form of Taiwan hermeneutics to strengthen the relational commitment in exploring the perspectives of Bnkis. So it basically means that when I'm doing research, I'm thinking about who am I as a Taiwan, and what kind of these policies or practices mean to the Dayan community? And how can I analyze it in line with or align with the Dayan interest as a group? So not just judging Dayan not working hard enough from the state storytelling line, but more from the indigenous point of view. So for me, I don't enter the field or extract data because I feel that it is very rude, dismissive, disrespectful, and unethical. For me, data should be produced in close collaboration with the Bnkis, with the elders or participants. And it is rooted in these respectful relationships and giving space to their own aspirations, their worries, their thinking, that we can produce meaningful research data. And in the end, we should give back as much as we can in the possible form. And in particular, through the idea of method and data, I did home visits and then I did interviews with the elders. I have interviewed 8 yudas, which is male elders, 6 yaki, which is a female elder in Dayan language, to share their stories. They're around 60 to 90 years of age. They all self-identify as Dayan, and all of them experience the traversing between the Dayan life world and the world dominated by the colonial system. And the colonial system could be the Japanese or the Chinese. And the Bnkis, the elders, were asked to talk about themselves, their everyday experience, focusing on Dayan identity, what Dayan identity meant to them. So in the beginning, I asked them to talk about well-being and health and care. But then in the end, it kind of goes back to what does it mean to be a Dayan? And I think that is a more radical and fundamental question for them, obviously. And I think that also informs what we need to think about care. So I hope that it makes sense to you. And in addition to this method and data, I'm always thinking about elevating Dayan epistemology methods, because for me, that's very important, as I explained earlier. So I have been thinking and then incorporating Dayan tradition jisan, which is, it means storytelling. And I'm drawing from constructivist, grounded theory perspective. And I also, I do not collect data in this sense, but also I focus more about co-creating the meaning and knowledge through partnership with the Bnkis. And I also incorporate, in addition to jisan, which is storytelling, I also incorporate Shili, which means like river coming together. And it also means that people gathering together in Dayan language. So I also incorporate that concept. And also I incorporate this concept of malahang, which means care in the Dayan context. And it's just giving me so much more clue about care, because when I was thinking about care, I was thinking about this very bodily care. But then when I was thinking along the line with the elders, it just opens up all different these windows of opportunities, that because the care could be located between human and non-human, with the land, and with so many different elements. And I feel that it's just so beautiful, and it's so unethical to cut that out. And lastly, about the data analysis, before we go into the voices of Bnkis, that I analyze the data through a reflexive thematic approach based on indigenous foundations to analyze in the Bnkis lived experiences. And I also try to incorporate Sean Wilson's this relational accountability. So it's basically thinking about our relations as a grounding factor for producing accountable data, producing accountable outcome or results or findings, because it is a lifelong relationship instead of I just go into the community and get out. And also I'm grounding in the cultural protocols that is important for the Bnkis. And of course, it's not written anywhere, these protocols, but it's more about like try and error, what works for the Bnkis, what makes them feel more relaxed, what makes them feel agitated. So it is a try and error process that have been testing and then trying to find a balance throughout this 4 years of field work. And then I have transcribed it into like transcripts and then interviews, and I discuss and I write mind map and stuff like that. And it was a long process. It took me 6 years to really finalize the process of doing a dissertation, but I'm very happy that I feel that it changed me as a person, and it's a very worthwhile process. So let's talk about decolonizing here through the stories of the Bnkis. So the voices from the elders. I have categorized it just for the convenience of presenting here into 3 themes. The first theme is Hemali Simbilan na Bnkisan. The direct translation is the town of their ancestors. So it basically means Dayan language. And Dayan language is a theme that just kept being in our conversation and talked about among the Bnkis. And it was partly lost due to the harsh assimilation policies during the colonial rule, as we saw earlier in the presentation, the different waves of colonizers. And the image in the background, just in case you're curious, is a page from the Bible. So Bibles are very important. Whenever I met the Bnkis, that many of them talked about the church and the Bible. And in this particular picture, there is Chinese on the upper side, and there is Dayan language, but transliterated by the Bopomorpho writing system on the downside. So if you're interested, we can talk more about it later. But yeah, so this system of writing and Bible in the form of Bible is very common in the community. So in terms of language, the weakening of Dayan language is identified by many elders Bnkis as a key area of loss. And it is a cumulative emotional and psychological wounding across generations in our community. And I identified it through the stories from the Bnkis in the theme of militaristic conquest, the assimilation policies enforced in the schools, where you can only speak national languages, Chinese or Japanese, and from tourism and interethnic marriages. And these are all the elements of historical trauma that has a bearing in caring for the Bnkis that we need to think about today. So let's start with the militaristic conquest. How the Dayan language had been attacked in the recent colonial history. So this Bnkis, I have changed his name into Viru, but his real name is not Viru. But for the presentation, Viru told me that his grandfather had been a local chief. And I think, I don't know if I have time to read this, but just I can read part of it. And then if you want, we can discuss more later. So Biru told me that my grandfather and his people live in the mountains where there were lots of cypress trees. The Japanese wanted to make weapons out of these trees, so they attacked us. We Dayan people did not have any good weapons, and we were outnumbered. We fought bravely, but we could not win. In the end, my grandfather was afraid that his people would be annihilated. So he decided to give my father, he was 10 years old at the time, to the Japanese police. This was followed by a negotiation between my grandfather and the government general, which is the government that governed Taiwan during the Japanese rule between 1895 and 1947. The battle was seized with the condition that my father would accept to receive Japanese education. So Biru was telling this story of the militaristic conquest that has pushed him to be away from his Dayan roots. And as we can see here, it is like a combination of political colonization and economic colonization, right? Like they want the trees and then to develop Japan. And also it's also combined and tangled up with the spiritual or cultural colonization, which they are further from the Dayan root. Let's look at another example, learning dominant languages. So Tali told me that I learned to speak Dayan and later Japanese, Chinese, and even English to attract tourists. I had the photography booth and I employed 10 guys and 10 ladies working for me. The number of Japanese tourists was crazy. They swarmed into the village like ants. Dali was very enthusiastic when he was telling me this. Like he was like using all kinds of hand gestures, and like there are many Japanese tourists. So from this passage, like we can learn that for Dali, he learned the dominant languages and also a lot of other languages through the tourism. And I feel like it is such a huge, big impact this tourism, economic colonization had on the people. And let's take a zoom in from another angle. So since 1945, Mandarin Chinese became the only legitimate language. And here Jiwas told me that before everyone spoke Dayan, our own language, but in school things changed. We had to speak Guoyu, which means Mandarin Chinese. The goal of school was to make everyone speak Guoyu. So another participant told me that Dayan language was like paint falling off from the wall. You cannot do anything about it. It is like a natural process that you kind of just have to let go. And there's just so much sorrow behind that sentence. And I think that has so much we can learn from when we are thinking about care. And then there is also this perspective of Dayan language is no practical use. So you need to compromise. So from this passage, Jiwas was telling me that her husband does not speak Dayan and she does not speak her husband's mother tongue. So they have to compromise and just speak Guoyu, Mandarin Chinese, to their children. And it just kept me thinking that what kind of trauma or historical circumstances that you decided to stop speaking your own language to your children, and how much cumulative pain that would be inside this decision, right? But luckily, I also talked with Jiwas' son, and he told me that he was relearning Dayan. So Hagao told me, when I was in elementary school, all my mother's cousins and family spoke Dayan. I heard Dayan everywhere on the street. When people visited my mother, they were all speaking Dayan. I sat quietly in the corner, listening to them, especially when I had shorter school days. I would come back home and found a whole village of people speaking Dayan. I listened. That's why I love the sound of Dayan. I'm familiar with how it sounds. And it is rooted in this familiarity that he started to read and write and speak Dayan. And I think that is just such an impactful, beautiful story of coming back to who you are and resisting colonization. So this is the last slide of the first theme. The second theme is about Rhyah, which is mountains. So for the Dayan people, mountains are very important because we are the mountain people living, as you can see in this village, like over there in the mountains, and you have to coexist with the animals in the mountains, also the climate. And it is really a key expression of going to the mountains that I have heard constantly from the Bnkis. In Chinese, they would say 去山上. It's like going up the mountains. And Yugan told me here that his happiest moment is to go to the mountains, to go up to the mountains and down the rivers, set traps in the mountains. And he just keeps repeating this. And you find that this is such an important like event to store energy from. And you might want to ask, like, why does it matter? Is it because it is like entertainment? But I think it is deeper than that, right? For me, I read it as a continuation of Dayan way of being. For one Bnkis who is soon almost 90 years, he said that how he enjoyed his daily routine, just riding up his motorcycle up to the mountains early in the morning, to work on the field in his garden, and then he would come back to attend to the day club, the day activity center. And then he told me, I love working in the mountains. I'm used to it. I'm in the mountains when I was small, and it is good for my body. It gives me a sense of continuity. What makes me happy is to see all the vegetables growing. And for this Bnkis, food is not just a source of nutrients, but it's more have a relational anchor with his own land and the ancestral spirits that is on this land. So I think that we can come to this direction of that Dayan really have a special relationship with the land. And I was talking with this older Bnkis about who wanted to go to up to the mountains, but he couldn't do that anymore because his bodily function is too frail. And he told me that my heart ached when I saw the weeds were taking over. Without pulling up the weeds, in the matter of 1 or 2 months, the vegetables cannot grow. And my children would just be so worried about me and that I might fall down, but still I wanted to go up to the mountains. The third theme is Gaga, read, connecting to the Dayan law. So Gaga for the Bnkis is very simple. So Gaga was like, as Dali told, that Gaga was very good for us, Dayan. Gaga is like Bible's 10 commandment. The image on the left is the Bible in Japanese where Dali reads because he reads very fluent Japanese. He said that we always help each other and it was good. Sometimes we were exhausted because of work, but in our hearts, we were very happy. We were really happy. We come home and life was simple and happy, all because of Gaga. And I feel that within this understanding of Gaga, the idea of hard work is tolerable, even to be celebrated because you're a real Dayan. And for several Bnkis, they spoke of the importance of being responsible, working hard, and caring for the families, for the land is a prerequisite for being a Dayan. So just to go very fast back, because I'm looking at the time, sorry for going over a little bit, that when we think about colonization and decolonization and care, and colonization is really in different forms, in political, economic, cultural, or welfare forms. And in all these different forms that we can see how it bears a burden on care. And if we think about coloniality is about controlling knowledge and subjectivity, the way that we're thinking the design and the organization of the care system at the moment for the elderly person is very much without the contribution or the inclusion of the Dayan's elders' voices. And I think that we need to really go towards the decolonization, which we can define as the activities in and through which indigenous peoples, including the Bnkis, to reclaim their identity, their land, their languages, culture, knowledge systems, way of being and knowing, worldviews, etc. So to put it in a very concrete term, that I feel that to really decolonize care, we need to tell the stories from the Bnkis, from the people who is at the margins. And it's important to do the storytelling because the stories of the rule, as we see in the beginning, the biomedical paradigm, or the visualization from the Ministry of Health and Welfare, they are silencing the other voices. And we need to use these voices at the margin to intervene the ruling stories. And at the same time, after listening to the stories, we have the responsibility to recognize that the colonization and the trauma that is keep happening. And we need to develop and think about different ways of, for example, trauma-informed care for the elderly. And we really need to disrupt these colonial relations. By doing so, we can do that. And also we can open up cracks for change, for elderly care, for the elders, Bnkis, the elders in your community, and for the society and the world as a whole. And I think slowly I'll draw to the close. And sorry for going over time. I want to say thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to share Moai Simugwara. Thank you so much.